is a disgrace.
The whole day was 11.5 hours of bitter recriminations, rancour. Many people felt that it was Parliament at its worst.
Even these turkeys won't be able to prevent Christmas.
This Prime Minister to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
Well, we're talking about the 25th of September in 2019, and it was a point in time when Brexit was becoming increasingly bitter and angry, the rows over how to get a Brexit deal or indeed maybe leave the EU without a deal. Theresa May had tried and failed to get a Brexit deal. Boris Johnson took over as Prime Minister in July, and he said he was determined to get Brexit done. And one of the moves that he made was to decide to suspend or prorogue Parliament because he felt that Parliament was blocking the attempts by the government to get a deal, or at least to get Britain and the UK out of the EU.
All this mumbo-jumbo about how Parliament is being deprived of the opportunity to scrutinise Brexit. What a load of claptrap.
However, his dastardly plan was blocked by the Supreme Court, and so MPs who had been scattered to the winds, they all had to come back to Parliament. They were called back for an emergency one-day session that went on for 11.5 hours. Everyone assembled in the Commons for what turned out to be one of the angriest, bitterest, most emotional days, certainly, that I had ever seen in the House of Commons.
They don't like to hear it, Mr. Speaker. They don't like the truth. Twice they have been asked to let the electorate decide upon whether they should continue to sit in their seats while they block 17.4 million people's votes. This Parliament is a disgrace.
It was Geoffrey Cox who took to the dispatch box very first of all. Geoffrey Cox was the Attorney General in Boris Johnson's cabinet, and he was known very much for his sort of rhetorical flourishes, his use of oratory. He liked to make big, blustering speeches. He basically faced questions about the legal advice that he had issued as Attorney General. What was the basis of it, and was it all within the law? So he started off quite quietly and reasonably.
I am bound by the long-standing convention that the views of the law officers are not disclosed outside the government without their consent.
His voice got louder and louder, and he sounded, one MP said to me, he sounded just like Brian Blessed in a Whitehall farce, because he was obviously finding it really difficult to contain his anger and frustration that Parliament was blocking the government from getting Brexit done.
This Parliament should have the courage to face the electorate. But it won't. It won't, because so many of them are really all about preventing us leaving the European Union at all. But the time is coming. The time is coming, Mr. Speaker, when even these turkeys won't be able to prevent Christmas.
It was a performance by Geoffrey Cox. He was used to holding court in a court, and it was effectively the same sort of holding court, except this was at the dispatch box of the Commons. And he was waving his arms around, and he was turning back to MPs behind him, some of whom were applauding the way that he was addressing the opposition. And the opposition were shouting, there was screams, there was some applause sometimes when somebody made a particular point, and it got louder and louder. And then there was one MP, a Labour MP called Barry Sheerman, who clearly had had it up to here with what he described as Mr Cox's barrister's bluster, and he decided to lay into the Attorney General.
Mr Speaker, I came into the chamber today thinking I felt sorry for the Attorney General. But as he started, I did, fair enough, but every word he has uttered, no shame today, no shame at all. The fact that this government cynically manipulated the prorogation to shut down this House so that it couldn't work as a democratic assembly. He knows that that is the truth. And to come here with his barrister's bluster to obfuscate the truth, and for a man like him, a party like this, and a leader like this Prime Minister, to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
I'm not sure I could discern in that marshmallow of the rhetoric any actual question.
I think speeches like this, they look old-fashioned, they look Dickensian. Moments like this, probably people will look at it from the outside and think, what are these people up to? But I think that day just really encapsulated the frustration and the anger that was being felt, not just in Parliament, but also out in the country. Geoffrey Cox was embodying that feeling. That was just the warm-up act.
Mr Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
Boris Johnson had been in New York addressing the UN when the Supreme Court passed their judgment, so he had to fly back to the UK. And he managed to get into the Commons at about 6:30 in the evening. He used this term, the Surrender Act, 15 times during that session in the Commons. Now, the Surrender Act was referring to a piece of legislation that had been passed in the name of Hilary Benn, the Labour MP, and it basically forced the government to ask for an extension to Brexit if it hadn't reached a deal by mid-October. Now, Boris Johnson felt that this was a surrender act and that it was binding his hands. And a lot of MPs argued that that use of surrender act was a pejorative term, that it was actually inciting anger and violence against MPs who were perceived to be blocking Brexit. And one of those MPs who got up to make that point was Labour's Paula Sherriff. Now, she represented a constituency that was the neighbouring constituency to Jo Cox, who, you'll remember, had been murdered in the course of her duties. And there's a little shield that's up in the back of the Commons chamber, which is a token of a reminder of Jo Cox. It just is a remembrance plaque to say, you know, this is where she sat.
Paula Sherriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I genuinely do not seek to stifle robust debate, but this evening the Prime Minister has continually used pejorative language to describe an Act of Parliament passed by this House. And I'm sure that you would agree, Mr. Speaker, that we should not resort to using offensive, dangerous or inflammatory language for legislation that we do not like. And we stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor. And I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first. Absolutely. So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I think, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. Because the reality is, this is a bill.
Now, There was anger because a lot of MPs felt that he was being disingenuous, that he was almost ignoring the impact of what Paula Sherriff was saying about the threats to MPs and obviously the memory of Jo Cox. And he actually really got MPs angry a little bit later on when he effectively said the best way to honour the memory of Jo Cox is to get Brexit done.
There is only one way to end those tensions in this country, and that is to get Brexit done. And if she really thinks that by staying on in the EU month after month after October the 31st, those tensions, that acrimony, all that storm on Twitter is going to abate, she's got another thing coming. Let's get this thing done.
The whole day was 11 and a half hours, really, of bitter recriminations, rancour, rows, the sort of day in Parliament that I certainly hadn't seen, and I wouldn't really want to see it again. And I think that people will think it's probably Parliament at its worst. Parliament was being pitted against the people, and that was what made a lot of MPs really sad, actually, because they felt that they were trying to do the best for the people they represented. But here we were in this angry, angry day being told that Parliament was the blocker and the people had got it right. And those arguments went on for a long time after that day.